Hi, welcome back. In this lecture, let's quickly take a look into the difference between Hibernate and Spring Data JPA. Well, Hibernate is basically an implementation of JPA specification. Well, JPA is just a specification or a standard API that facilitates object relational mapping to manage relational data in a Java applications. Well, in Java, JPA basically provides object relational mapping feature. Okay, it means that instead of creating the SQL statements, we can directly persist an object into relational database table using JPA. Okay, and JPA is just a specification. It don't have any implementation, right? So that is where the Hibernate comes into picture. Hibernate is basically a ORM framework that implements JPA specification. Okay, so Hibernate is a JPA implementation provider. Alright, on the other hand, if you can see Spring Data JPA. Well, Spring Data JPA is abstraction layer on top of JPA to reduce the amount of boilerplate code required to implement DAO layer. Okay, so Spring Data JPA is nothing but it is an abstraction layer developed on top of JPA to reduce the amount of boilerplate code that is required to implement the data access object. Alright, so Spring Data JPA internally uses JPA APIs and Hibernate basically implements JPA APIs. And if you can see here, Hibernate internally uses JDBC to communicate with the database. This is how the basically flow goes. Spring Data JPA internally uses JPA APIs and Hibernate it implements JPA APIs and Hibernate internally uses JDBC to communicate with the database. Well, let me summarize the difference between Hibernate and Spring Data JPA. Well, Hibernate is a Java-based ORM tool that provides a framework for mapping application domain model objects to the relational database tables and vice versa. Well, if we use the Hibernate ORM framework, then we don't have to create the SQL statement to perform different operations like CRUD operations, basically like insert operations, select, delete and update, right? So Hibernate, it basically behind the scene generate SQL statement and it will use the JDBC to communicate with the database. We don't have to create the SQL statement if we use Hibernate ORM framework, right? So we can use a Hibernate framework to directly map application domain model objects to the relational database tables. It means that we can use a Hibernate to directly persist an object into a relational database table. Alright, we don't have to create the SQL statements. Well, on the other hand, Spring Data JPA is an abstraction layer on top of JPA to reduce the amount of boilerplate code required to implement DAO layer. Well, Spring Framework basically provides Spring Data JPA module which is developed on top of JPA to reduce the amount of boilerplate code required to implement data access object layer. Well, Spring Data JPA minimizes a lot of boilerplate code, guys. We just have to extend Spring Data JPA provided a repository interface. That's it. We will get a full CRUD operations and Spring Data JPA provides out-of-the-box implementation for all the CRUD operations. Hibernate is a JPA provider. It means Hibernate, it implements JPA specification. On the other hand, Spring Data JPA is not a JPA provider. Spring Data JPA, it simply hides the JPA behind its repository abstraction. It means that Spring Data JPA, it is developed as abstraction layer on top JPA to reduce the boilerplate code required to implement DAO layer. Alright. Well, Spring Data JPA uses Hibernate as a default JPA provider. Well, Spring Boot offers a starter dependency to use Spring Data JPA in a Spring Boot project. And Spring Boot starter data JPA dependency, it internally uses Hibernate as a default JPA provider for Spring Data JPA. Spring Data JPA cannot work without a JPA provider. Well, there can be a multiple JPA providers, for example, Hibernate, Eclipse Link, Top Link, MyBetis. Okay, so there are a lot of implementations for JPA specification, right? And Spring Data JPA cannot work without JPA provider. We have to provide one of the JPA provider in order to work with Spring Data JPA. You can use Hibernate or you can use Eclipse Link, you can use MyBetis, you can use Top Link. Okay, you have to use one of the JPA provider in order to work with Spring Data JPA. Alright, so this is the difference between Hibernate and Spring Data JPA. Alright, I will see you in next lecture.